Great to have so many returning folks. I see a lot of returning names and faces, some folks who maybe are joining for just the first time. So welcome to everyone. And if you could, please open up the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. Introduce yourself over there. And then keep that chat window open because that will be your chance to interact with our special guest today. We'll be introducing in just a minute. I saw folks as we were waiting to get started from all corners of the United States, coast to coast in Canada. I saw folks from England, Colombia, India. So we've got a nice international audience this morning. So once again, welcome everyone. If you're new to I4CP, we are the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We're a human capital research firm that discovers the people practices that drive high performance. We do that primarily through our many research studies across human resource topics, where we look at what high performance companies, which we define by revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction, what those high performers are truly doing differently than their low performing counterparts. We like to tease out, say what what practices are distinguish that top quartile from say the bottom 25%. We always, of course, report out on the aggregate data as well, see what the averages are, but we really like to hone in on what high performers do differently. Here we are a member-based organization. Here you see just a small sampling of logos from just some of our several hundred member companies. You see they range from very large organizations like 3M and Visa, Amazon, General Mills, and others. We've got a growing cohort of unicorn organizations, smaller startups. We've got smaller regional banks and healthcare organizations in membership as well. And they really span across all industries from high tech to finance, manufacturing, retail, you name it. If you're with a member organization and joining us today, special welcome to you. Great to have you with us. If you're not with a member organization but would like to learn more about what that entails, what all the benefits are, just reach out to any I4CP employee that you can find on LinkedIn or elsewhere, or just reach out to us at our website, i4cp.com, and we can get you that information. My name is Tom Stone. I'm a senior research analyst here at I4CP, and I have the pleasure of co-hosting most of these I4CP Next Practice weekly calls week to week. This week, I'm joined by my close colleague on the research team, another senior research analyst, Katheryn Brekken. Good to have you with us. Good morning, Katheryn.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you again. You'll be the star in a couple of weeks. We'll get to that in just a moment. As you can see, her name there appearing on July 11th, coming up with our other colleague, Rob Cross. And then you see we've got guests coming up from Target and Symetra after that. I do want to alert everyone, particularly those not in the US, we will not be having a call next week. That's July 4th, which I think most people in the world know is a holiday in the US. So we won't be here next Thursday, but we will be back on July 11th. And for that one, since you'll be one of the two stars of that program, Katheryn, could you say a little bit about our team network effect study?
Sure, absolutely. And I don't want to wear out my welcome on your show. So luckily I'm coming with my co-author and colleague, Rob Cross, who's Senior Vice President of Research here at I4CP and a distinguished professor at Babson College. Building off of his decades really of research on collaboration, we dug into, team performance and effectiveness. And, bottom line is on average, teams could increase their productivity by 39%. If they improve collaboration. So we've tested some, relatively low lift, collaborative behaviors that can really, heighten team performance and drive impact on the market performance of organizations, really impact that bottom line.
Yeah, and I would encourage folks to come to this session next week because you and Rob will be or not 2 weeks, I should say, on the 11th. Because you guys will be sharing some of the key findings. Some of that is available in the brief that Zeta has put the link into over in the chat. And of course, members have access to the full report. But this study really did go beyond the sort of run-of-the-mill team collaboration studies that many organizations have done in the past. You got to intentionally get people together, do trust falls, those kind of things. This goes way, way beyond that. So I think we're all looking forward to that session on the 11th. Also want to note one last announcement as well. We do have a live survey in the field now. This is the latest in a string of culture studies that we've done. Going back many years, we did a major seminal study called Culture Renovation many years ago. We did a culture fitness, culture health study about 18 months ago, and we wanted to sort of reprise that with some of the same questions, some additional new questions as well. We're calling this Culture Health, the State of Culture Health in 2024. So if you could do that survey after the call today, we'd really appreciate it. We'd love as many participants from Next Practices Weekly to please participate if you can, represent your organization, or share it with a colleague. If there's someone else that you think would be better suited in your company to do this survey, please pass it along to them. And once again, the link for that Zeta has put over in the chat. All right, with that, I'm going to turn things over to you, Katheryn, to help facilitate the conversation and introduce our special guest for today. A reminder to everyone else, please keep the chat open and ask questions as we go along.
Thank you, Tom. And I am thrilled to introduce to you all RJ Milnor. I can see in the chat that many of you are familiar with RJ. Of course, his most important title is co-chair of I4CP's People Analytics Board. But he's had a very distinguished, unique career, really starting in finance and then becoming a leader in HR analytics at companies like Equifax, Chevron, McKesson, and Uber. And this year, you became a CHRO of Valuetainment, which is a growing media company, which I think has over 3 million followers on YouTube and the #1 business podcast. RJ, let's kick it off by talking, tell us a little bit more about your journey. Tell us about Valuetainment and how you came to be there.
Well, Katheryn and Tom, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the opportunity. And it's great to see so many dear friends on the webinar today. So thank you all for joining in. I look forward to seeing your comments and questions as we go through this. So Valuetainment is based on the premise that we believe there's a need for a positive and compelling voice to champion entrepreneurship and capitalism. And we are that voice. And we engage with both viewers and clients through a variety of different means. We have a media channel, which is Valuetainment. We have a podcast. You mentioned having over 5 million viewers or 5 million subscribers actually on those podcasts, like the Patrick Bet David podcast, or PBD podcast. I think we're north of 1 billion views on that now. So we're really talking about both business, entrepreneurship, what it means to be an entrepreneur, and helping leaders grow their businesses through the media channel. We also engage with founders and entrepreneurs and future leaders through a consulting business called Bet David Consulting. And what's unique about that, and one of the things that drew me there, was this is a consulting business that's led by expert operators. So people that have founded businesses, that have grown them, that have exited businesses, and they're imparting their expertise to people going through that right now. So one of the things that you've done a lot of research on at I4CP is trust, and that bond of trust from leaders to leaders is so important, and something that I think is a differentiator, especially in the management consulting business. And then we have another business called Connect, and Connect is a fantastic peer-to-peer application where users can ask experts in the moment for advice. It could be anything from carpentry and plumbing to leadership advice, how to start a business. Do I need a COO at this stage? How do I kind of recruit high-performing individuals? So something that I might kind of chime in on. And the responses are instantaneous. So instead of, say, an 8 to 12% response rate that you might have on other social media platforms, our response rate, last time I looked this week, was 97% to a question that's asked. So the responses happen. They happen from qualified experts. And then the immediacy of the response is pretty compelling. So I think 50% of questions get answered in 24 hours. So it's wonderful to create that knowledge economy. So that's a little bit about us, Katheryn.
That's super interesting, and you're obviously really passionate about that. How did you get to be there? Can you talk about your winding road, your career that led you there, and sort of some insights that you have now as CHRO, looking back at all those other leadership positions that you've had within organizations?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I think a red thread has been business impact. I see a good friend Amit on the line as well, and like a lot of us, my career actually started in finance in one way or another, and I did my grad work in economics and finance, and my first job was on Wall Street as an investment banker, actually on the derivatives trading floor in a bank in New York. And one of the things that captured my attention early on in my career, in my early and mid-20s, was what's the role of people and talent on financial performance. And at that time, like going the way back machine, it was the first .com bubble bursting, right? So we were trying to figure out how do we value these companies with high revenue, low or no profitability, and we really didn't get it right, or most of us didn't get it right the first time. And a question that was going through my mind and some others was, well, can you actually quantify leadership? Can you look at how companies manage their talent and talent practices and create a link back to profitability and total shareholder return? And that question fascinated me. And it took me actually away from financial services and into research and consulting. The great company that some of you might know, Corporate Executive Board, which is doing some great work there. And that began my education really in human resources. I knew nothing about HR candidly at that time. But I did have a lot of curiosity, and that's a trait I always look for in teams. And so we were doing a lot of work on that at CEB, which later became Gartner, and began my journey in HR. So through the research side, we're doing quant research, and on the qualitative side, I began just visiting and talking with hundreds, thousands of companies around the world, understanding what they did and how that applied to our research. And that then led to going to the practitioner side. So a great career on the analytics side of starting greenfield analytics functions at companies like Citrix, and then moving on to leadership roles at companies like Chevron, McKesson, Uber, and now here.
Fascinating. And I love that really it was, your curiosity and interest in how talent practices impact the business that really got that started and got you away from Wall Street. But that's also I4CP's mission. So, it makes sense that we've come together. I want to ask you about analytics because, I'm a researcher. I support the People Analytics Board here at I4CP, and I know it can be intimidating to people who aren't in the analytics space. As a CHRO, what's your perspective on the responsibilities and the structure of a 21st century people analytics team? What does it look like in an advanced organization, and where should it live?
Yeah. So let me break down a couple of things. I think a people analytics function, much like a larger HR function, has two roles. One role is to drive the business forward, because for most of us, it is part of a for-profit organization, a for-profit business. The second is to be the steward of the employees. Okay? So, a question I often get from executive teams or from others is, who are we in service of? Who do we serve? And that can be a very difficult question. And sometimes we're tempted to say, well, we serve our employees. I don't know that's actually correct. I think we serve the business. We serve the business, and we're the steward of the employees. And it's a really difficult line to walk sometimes. So when we think about a people analytics function, how do we drive the business forward? How do we drive business impact? How do we drive profitability? Going back to that first question that I was trying to answer back on as an investment banker on Wall Street and at CEB and at others. How do we do that while taking care of our workforce and engaging them and enabling them to thrive both professionally and personally? And that's one of the things that candidly makes HR so difficult. I think maybe one of the most difficult functions, but also makes it so incredibly rewarding. And it's one of the reasons why I love it and I love this job. So what does that actually look like in terms of a structure? Getting to the second part of your question, I think there needs to be a research element to a modern people analytics function and an action element. And there's been some great research about what is version 1.0 people analytics, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. I think in 1.0 is very research and academically oriented. We're doing a lot of research, white papers. What does this look like? 2.0, more metrics and data. And where we are now is how do we incorporate those things to kind of drive productization and drive action. So we do need a research foundation. We can't just run and gun and make decisions on the fly. But we do need to incorporate these things into live tests, into experimentation, and productize the scale as much as possible. So as an example, you might have one side of a people analytics function that's more people science oriented, where it's the research side. You may have another side that's more data and eng, where you bring those groups together. Another side that's productization. Another side that's business partnership and consulting to help kind of drive and scale the insights into the business.
Oh, I was on mute. So sorry. Can you give some examples of maybe some experiences you've had where analytics has really driven business performance?
Yeah. So you were talking about collaboration earlier, and I think you've got a session coming up with Rob Cross in July, which I'm looking forward to. It's going to be a great session. One of the challenges that we had in a prior organization was productivity, especially coming off of the COVID years, so 2020, 2021, and there was a question of, are our employees fully productive? And we saw a big productivity spike, especially among engineers, immediately kind of post the beginning of COVID, so call it like March, April 2020. And then productivity started to kind of come down, and as people were coming back into the office, productivity started to cavitate, or oscillate is a better word. It would kind of go up and down into waves, and we're trying to understand what was happening with productivity. One of the things that we found was, as a culprit of this, was meetings and meeting volume. So on average, our managers were in nearly 20 hours of meetings per week. And so to kind of get to your question of what drove performance, the ways that we could help collaborate more effectively drove business performance. So we engaged in a study. It was a mixed method study driven by the people analytics team to understand, how are people meeting, how are they collaborating, and how could we streamline this? How can we make it more effective to drive business performance and to drive productivity? So we did a study where a group of managers basically did a diary study. They looked at every meeting they did, and documented what happened in that meeting. Did they feel it was productive or not? What could be more productive? At the same time, we back-ended this with quantitative work. So we were understanding in that meeting what was actually happening. So ingesting Slack data, ingesting email data, understanding how engaged were the participants. Were they becoming disengaged? It was like starting to do an email in the middle of this webinar, for instance, because RJ is really boring and he's going on too long. So all of that kind of work, and we could understand what types of meetings were effective and what weren't, what was happening with focus time, what wasn't. And that allowed us to have some very specific recommendations about what to do going forward. So what we realized, for instance, was half of the meetings that managers were in were status updates. So 50% of the meetings, 50% of this nearly 20 hours per week that managers were in, were just basic, reading off what happened during the week. That the majority of that could get pushed to pre-wiring or Slack updates, right? So we didn't need to do that. Very ineffective use of time, of collaborative time. The other thing we realized was that another finding was that we were creating very large meetings to have decisions, whereas to have a decision, we really need a maximum of 8 people in that meeting. So we could roll that out and say, hey, if we're doing a informational meeting, great, have 90 or 100 people on. If we need to drive a decision, try to keep it to less than 10, really less than 8 people to engage and drive decision making. Then also keep it to less than 30 minutes, because what we would see at about the 30-minute mark is the disengagement would start increasing. You'd have people starting to do emails, starting to do Slack, and that disengagement would increase as each minute ticked on. So some pretty actionable results on that. Likewise, if we could increase focus time, and there's a study, you mentioned Rob Cross, an article that I wrote with Rob and some others in Harvard Business Review a few years ago called Collaboration Overload is Sinking Productivity, where when we were able to increase focus time, we saw productivity increase. And so by deploying an application internally that move meetings around to allow more time for focus time. So we had, I think managers on average had about an hour of focus time on a daily basis. Really wanted that to be 3 hours or more of deep uninterrupted time. By trying to use by using an application to optimize that, we could see productivity increase. So a couple of ways to use data and analytics in a creative way to drive business impact.
Yeah, I mean, you're helping me with my time management hacks here, and then also really this so relates to the network team effect study, where you're talking about so preparing, with status updates pre-meeting, get that out of the way so you can buy back time, right? And then no more than 8 people when you're having a meeting about decision making. Larger meetings reserved for information sharing, and I think those are all really important hacks to know, but that you use data and that they're data backed is fascinating. And then just like another reason why people analytics is so important in the organization. You had talked about sort of like your view. It was almost like David Ulrich, where you're like, in service of what? HR is in service of the business, yes, but you said it's also in the work, the workforce and their well-being. Do you have an example maybe where data and analytics have helped with employee well-being, holistic well-being?
It's an interesting question. I think one of the things that we're seeing is this almost trifecta of trying to drive productivity, engagement, and well-being at the same time, and using data to do that. So in several companies, we were thinking about how do you push the dial on like, for instance, on employee engagement, and have well-being move at the same time, and have productivity move at the same time. One of the things that we were trying to look for as an example was burnout. So let's use kind of burnout and well-being. Going back to, just kind of thinking of a specific example, going back to some of the listening programs we had at Uber. So we moved to a continuous listening program shortly after the pandemic, and I kind of talk a little bit about why we did that. But we went from a annual employee survey program to a quarterly and then monthly employee listening program, or continuous listening program. One of the things that we were trying to understand was, hey, at what point are employees running at the right pace? At what point are they running kind of too hard? And how long do they need to run? How long can they run that pace, right? Before they kind of might burn out, or also might disengage. And so we monitor that in terms of work activity data as well as engagement data, and then bring that back. We didn't get, while I was there, we didn't get to the point of actually trying to optimize that, but we could monitor that.
Fascinating. And one of the questions I get a lot from folks is how do you make the workforce aware that you're monitoring that data, and that you're being responsible with the data?
Yeah, I think two things. First is be open and be honest. So transparency is absolutely critical. The worst thing, I think, well, one of the worst things that we can do is operate in darkness, especially around employee data, because like most things, if you create a vacuum, people are going to fill it with their own thoughts or their own worst fears. So come out, talk about what you're doing, be transparent, and also explain why we're doing it, which hopefully is in the best, we're doing it to help employees in the best interest. So for instance, talking about work activity data, we're doing that to help employees have more focus time. We're doing that to help employees be more productive. We're doing that to help employees' well-being and productivity. So being transparent with what we're doing, being transparent with the reason why we're doing it, I think is always the right course of action. The second thing, though, is to have a code of ethics or an ethics charter. And that's especially, it's important for small companies, an early stage company like mine right now, but for large companies as well. So how are we looking at data? How are we going to use it? How are we using confidential or sensitive information? How are we going to use experiments? How are we going to go through experiments? What's our approach to data privacy? Having all of those things documented is critically important. And it's not just important for employees, by the way. I mean, it's great for employees to be able to see that, especially given the volume of information that's available to us now and the ways that we can use information, which I mean, is exponentially different than when I started this 20 some years ago. But it's really helpful for us as a teams, as a head of HR, as a head of a people analytics function, as a member of a people analytics team, to have that guidance when there is a question to say, let me go back to that ethics charter, or let me go back to my data governance privacy, or data governance policy for some guidance on this. Because inevitably there will be times when someone has a really interesting idea and you don't want to wing it. You really don't want to be in a situation where like, oh, let's just see what happens. It's a terrible spot to be in. So to have that charter that you can go back to and say, these are our principles. So, what are our ethical principles? How do we govern ourselves? And then I'd say as a part of that charter, having a data governance committee or some kind of committee like that. So for instance, we would have a cybersecurity and data privacy committee, or there are many other kinds of structures that you can have. Typically, HR will be involved, legal will be involved, you might have finance involved, but have a cross-functional committee that can bounce these ideas back and forth.
That is so important, having a strong data governance policy, being transparent. It really is a nice segue to where I wanted to go next, which is AI. So at HR Tech last year, and that's coming up again, it'll be interesting to see, it seemed like every vendor was sporting some new generative AI feature. What do you think about all these emerging tools, and any prediction on how this industry is going to evolve as like HRIS mega companies like Workday launch their models?
Yeah, I'm watching closely, so I love it. I think there are a few things that come to my mind immediately. And do I know where it's going? No. And if anybody tells you they know where it's going, I'm skeptical. But I like to think about what does generative AI do really well. And that's the way I think about it in terms of how to use it in an organization. So what does it do really well? It collects mass amounts of information and synthesizes it. That's what it does extraordinarily well, at least at this phase. And then there are people that know infinitely more about this than I do. So Guru Sethupathi is a great example, and many others. When I think about this, there are two use cases that immediately come to mind for me. One is policy automation, and the second is workforce planning, only because I'm really close to workforce planning for a lot of my career. So on policy automation, we have so many HR policies and workforce policies, and that can get very complex. One of the things that I'm passionate about is trying to simplify that and create as much freedom and responsibility inside the workforce as possible. So take the bureaucracy out of the system, but still, we have policies, right? There might be questions about benefits, there might be questions about whatever it might be. So generative by AI is a great way to make that a conversation with an AI agent. So I don't need an HR service center as much. I don't need as many shared services if I can automate that through an AI agent. Great example, easy to implement, or relatively easy to implement. Now that I think there is risk on the response, and that's one thing that's very important to have governance around and testing around, is what is the response to a question, because we need to get that right. We need to get that right every time. So maybe there needs to be a person in the middle. These are great questions to ask and things to test. What I'm particularly excited about right now is the role AI plays in workforce planning, particularly around skills. So if you think about two challenges with workforce planning traditionally, one is around scenario analysis. So what are the different scenarios that my business might go in from either from a supply or demand perspective? So from a demand perspective, what does the future look like? And that's a very difficult exercise. Back in the day, we had war rooms, or we're putting paper up on walls. Now it's definitely a more digital exercise, but still, that's difficult. With AI now and the computing power involved, we can run scenarios a lot faster. From a supply side, though, it's also a difficult exercise. You're trying to figure out where do you put people, and what do those daisy chains look like. So AI is fascinating there. I think the big jump that I've seen, and there are some great examples of early stage companies that are doing this work extraordinarily well, is how do we involve skills in that workforce planning process, and have a more skills-based approach, and getting away from candidly what are pretty static taxonomies that go out of date very, very quickly, and have a more adaptive approach of understanding what skills are present in my workforce, where there's skill adjacencies, and then also where might there be related skills that don't even look like the skills that I was anticipating. So for instance, on if you think about majority workforce or a non-degreed workforce, can I look into a non-degreed workforce and find skills that actually look very, very similar to what I would need for a digital workforce? That's really hard to do if you're just looking at resumes, or if you're looking at past experience. And I think it's going to be absolutely critical as we go forward, just given the labor market constraints that we're finding. And that's where AI can be extraordinarily helpful. And we're already seeing really good proof points of it from a couple of companies out there.
I want to jump in on that real
Yeah.
quick, just because I'm the member of our research team that's spent the most time on that skills question, particularly things like skills taxonomy, skills databases, connecting that to internal mobility. One of the big drivers of that these days that's new, because companies have been doing this kind of thing up and down for decades now, but these internal talent marketplaces that use AI to connect people based on their skills with either open positions in the organization or gigs or learning opportunities, whatever it may be, that's been a major driver. So I just wanted to note, RJ, thank you for raising that. I agree, AI is helping us make great strides in that area. And for the I4CP members on the call, if you're a relatively new member, just know that we've got a wealth of guidebooks and research and case studies in particular from other member companies and non-members as well that are seeing great success in this space.
Absolutely. We have a question here from Rebecca, who asked, how is the people analytics role growing to help organizations with ESG scores, and in particular the SEC's HCM performance disclosure requirements?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I was actually working on this back in about 10 years ago, 2014, 2017, and continue to work on it, at companies. I think part of it, the direct part of it on ESG is related to, say, the employee engagement side. So several companies are looking at employee engagement as part of their ESG. So that's, and if you look at, say, DEI reporting and DEI indexes, that's also a part. So that's one element. I think a people analytics function can be a hub for collecting this information and interpreting it. So some companies, depends on your size, will have an ESG or a corporate governance group, which is, I think, the quarterback for a lot of this kind of work. But people analytics can serve in the middle there too. One of the roles I've been privileged to play over time is working with those groups. We're working with total rewards, typically like the executive comp group, on how do we report this out. So whether it's in a proxy statement or in a separate statement, to look at those kinds of ESG scores, or think about how we're reporting for SEC statements. And I think there's an interesting question about one, what do we want to report from a compliance perspective? Secondly, what do we want to report from a marketing perspective of showing kind of who we are and who we want to be, and being as transparent as possible. So we see that with I get this question a lot, for instance, with diversity inclusion metrics of how much we want to show. I'm like, well, show as much as you can. Why not? Why wouldn't you? So I think there's an interesting question from a leadership side of what do you want to accomplish with the ESG side, with the ESG metrics, and then linking it back, of course, to financial performance is the third point.
One of the things that really strikes me about the compliance reporting aspect is how complicated it can get, especially when you're operating in multiple regions, so the EU versus the SEC. And this kind of goes back to my earlier question on AI. As that technology evolves, is it going to be easier is that reporting function going to be sort of lifted a bit for people analytics? Because everyone could have access to the data through just a large language model, human asking a question, as opposed to knowing all of the ins and outs of Workday or coding and so forth.
I think so. I'll give you my take on it, and I don't know if this is a bit of a hot take or not. I think people analytics is in a bit of an inflection point in terms of what it wants to be when it grows up. So, the function's been around for a good amount of time now, a couple of decades, and at least depending on how you kind of think about it. And it has this, I think we have this choice of, do we want to go back and be a reporting function, or do we want to progress and evolve and be an advisory function? And it's difficult to be both at the same time. So as a reporting function, there is a need for more data and more reporting, and certainly there's a massive need for data democratization. So how do we remove the bottleneck and get more data that's the right data to more people? And when we think about what drives a business, people drive the business. And so removing HR or removing people analytics or HR ops or whatever it might be as the bottleneck of that data and getting the right data to the right people is extraordinarily, extraordinarily important. Now, if that becomes the role of people analytics, I think it's a bit of a limited role. If instead it's, how do I use that data to drive a business outcome or a people outcome? How do I think about that data? How do I craft that data or govern it the right way to protect our employees, help our employees thrive, help our business thrive, protect our business? Those things, I think that's a different and more evolutionary role for the people analytics function, and that's more the camp that I'm in. To your question more directly, Katheryn, I think there is a role for automating that kind of reporting, and certainly AI could be a great agent for doing that. The thing that gives me pause, and I think an area where people analytics can be really important is, I think there needs to be some oversight in terms of what information we're sharing and how that information could be used in an unintended way, right? And it's just maybe the new iteration of an age-old problem. We've seen this way before AI. We've seen this in sharing basic kinds of employee information that we think is innocuous. Then we realize, oh, that was used in a way we really didn't intend, and it was really not good. And so, so having that person in the middle of saying, hey, what information do we want to share? How do we want to use this? And how could it be used for good? And what are the ways that it could be used in a way that's not good? Having that stewardship and having that governance is really important. And so going back to the ESG question, it's also a key role of HR and people analytics in ESG of saying, well, it's great to share lots of information, but let's just think about how that could be used in a positive way, and then how it could be used in a negative way, or how it could be misinterpreted. And having that kind of governance there is not something that AI necessarily does great right now, and what a person could do in a very good way.
Wow.
If I can jump in, one example of that, RJ, that I learned from our people analytics board several years ago, the group that you're now the co-chair of, is around people analytics functions that have tried to become more predictive, not just reporting out descriptively what's going on in the organization looking back. And in particular, a common task is to try and predict flight risk. So who in the organization is most likely to leave based on a lot of different criteria. A lot of different data about, past people who had the similar traits and then ended up leaving or not. And then sharing this with managers and leaders, the intention is positive. It's to try and encourage them, okay, have stay interviews, do other practices, give them learning opportunities, career opportunities, so that these top talent will stay if they're the ones that are sort of being yellow or red flagged as having high flight risk. But the downside of that, the unintended consequence could be, well, you flagged this person as being a high flight risk. I'm going to start ignoring them, not assigning them to projects. If they're just going to leave anyway, then, you know, so different managers might react very differently to that very same data when presented with it. Do you have any other examples like that of unintended consequences? The one I gave is sort of a common one.
Actually, Tom, I love that example, if you don't mind me running with it, because it's interesting looking at that from the people analytics perspective and looking at it from the CHRO perspective. You know, from the people analytics perspective, and the reason I'm jumping on that one, it's an often used example, but I think it's a really good one, is that I do like attrition risk models when I use them in aggregate. So at the group level, so, oh, this group is at higher risk of leaving, and I can quantify that in terms of the cost of attrition or the business impact, and I can look at collateral risk effects, and that's very helpful for managing the business. It's helpful for workforce planning. It's helpful for a lot of things. From a people analytics perspective, though, and I think from a business perspective, I get a little suspicious simply because people are notoriously difficult to measure. And so, you know, putting a, you know, 5 nines reliability on an attrition risk model at the individual level, at an aggregate level, we can get pretty accurate and have high validity. At an individual level, I spend a lot of time with this person at work, maybe not the rest of their lives, and there's a lot of things impacting their decision-making process. So can I be that confident at the individual level? I don't know. You know, I know wonderful, you know, IO psychs that can talk a lot more about this than I do, but I'm suspicious. So let me look at it at the CHRO level, though. As soon as we send that information out, to your point, Tom, we're affecting decision-making processes in ways that we may not have intended. So, okay, this person's at X% risk of leaving. So are we going to put them on a high potential plan? Are we going to give a retention bonus? That starts to affect the individual's decision-making. Now, how are other people looking at them? Because that's going to get out. Whether they've got a retention bonus or they're on a hypo plan or a development plan. Now, how have I affected the team around them? To your point, how is the manager thinking of them now? Is the manager just going to write them off and not give them key projects? So on and so forth. So yes, I'm not a fan of that for a couple of reasons.
This is a conversation we have a lot on the people analytics board, and it really highlights, I think, the important role that they play as gatekeepers of the information. And I know one of our members was saying she gets pressured all the time. You know, she provides the information in aggregate, but that manager really wants to know, you know, which individuals on the team are suffering in engagement, and she can't give it to them. I mean, they have very strong data governance policies, but people are very insistent on that. One of the things, though, and I mean, because we were talking about the democratization of data and technology, maybe making this easier for others to do basic reporting outside of people analytics. And one of our members, we are vendor agnostic, but she got Cruncher in her team. And when she showed it to executives, she literally said they became addicted to data because it was so easy for them to access, you know, the engagement scores of their team, to look at pay equity and other things. And it really kind of made it a lot more fun. So I think, like, is that the gold standard? Is that where we want to go, so that people analytics can sort of be free to do more, you know, research, predictive analytics, and so forth?
I think so. And you know, one thing I've talked about in other webinars is how do we align with the business to understand what people data they need to make decisions, and then engage with either a people analytics team or an HR team in a more effective way. And I agree with you with systems like Cruncher or others. You can make the data interface fun, so you're asking the right questions and you're engaging the right way. And I saw something in the chat earlier about the fear of data democratization, or the fear of sharing HR data. That can be scary because you're letting go of control. Whenever you let go of control, that can be a scary thing in a lot of situations. But as long as we're thoughtful about it, thoughtful about what we're sharing, and then we also understand the risks associated with it. So, you know, what is the upside? What is the downside? What are the legal constraints? I think then we can operate in a way, we can operate with clarity, and we can operate with confidence in doing that. I'll give you a good example from my time at Uber. So when when we were moving from kind of a myriad of Tableau dashboards and kind of disassociated reports, right, into something that was common. We used a different platform called Vizier for that, but we were trying to figure out, how do we design this? What does it look like? The people analytics team, in conjunction with HR, came up with a wireframe of these are the metrics that we think would be right. Of course, the people analytics team and engineering looked at the back end of what data we bringing in, what systems, and 30 odd or more systems are we integrating on the back end to make this work. But after we came up with the wireframe, we went to the business and said, what do you need? What should this look like to you? What data do you need, and how should it be visualized? In fact, we went to Uber Eats to do that, to the head of Uber Eats and his direct reports, and we created an MVP with them. So over the span of 4 weeks, they were testing it. We checked in with them on a weekly basis. In the span of 4 weeks, we made something like 150 plus product changes to get it just right for the business. That led to really our beta, and then we launched that beta to the executive team. Then we pushed it down from the executive team to managers across the company. And so designing with the business in mind, and not just with HR in mind, I think is the most important thing. Is we're not, depends on your viewpoint, but my viewpoint is we're not designing this for HR. We should be designing this for the business. Like I can go and look at all kinds of stuff in the HR side, but I really want to be designing a business-facing tool with people data so that they can make better business decisions than come to me with a question versus just giving them everything.
You mentioned a wireframe of data, and it just strikes my curiosity. And we're talking about, we want to tie people metrics to the business metrics, right? Is there like a menu of metrics or data that you would suggest HR provide on a regular basis to their C-suite?
It's a great question, and I think there are a host of people metrics that every company is going to look at, and they're really not very differentiated. And so I love, there are tons of folks on the call that know more about this than I do, but from my perspective, you're looking at headcount and different cuts of headcount by demographic, whether it's tenure and many other cuts. You're looking at hiring rates, you're looking at attrition rates, you're looking at different recruiting stats like offer acceptance rates. You're looking at engagement scores. There are some specific cuts around engagement that I think are becoming more important right now. So how you're measuring trust, how you're measuring psychological safety, because of the knock-on effects to things like collaboration, team performance, and innovation. So I would kind of dig into those if we're kind of going from the 101 to like 201, 301 level. Certainly attrition, but there are these are the things that we've measured since time immemorial, right? So we've always looked at those. There are I particularly look at transfer rates, and so mobility and across the organization, because also promo rates, but what we found is that lateral mobility and effective lateral mobility is a larger driver of employee retention and employee engagement than a lot of other things. So I do look at that pretty darn closely as a leading indicator of engagement and retention. But some of the big hit metrics are very unique to the company. So I take an 80-20 approach with this, where 80% of the metrics are going to be boilerplate metrics that we all use, right? They're on every dashboard that you're going to look at across 100 companies. They'll be the same. But some of the most important metrics are going to be really unique to your situation or your business. And I remember seeing back when I was at CEB, we did a case study on Pepsi. This is probably around 2002. So this is 22 years old, but where they had we called a strategic metrics cascade, where they would look at what's our business objective? What business problem are we trying to solve? What are the talent implications of that? So it's one cascade down. how is HR driving or related to that talent implication? What's the process behind that? Then what's the metric, and that's the raw data. So driving right from the kind of the business objective or strategic objective down to talent, to HR process, to metric, to raw data. That's where you get that last 20% of the metrics. And so it's an exercise I'd recommend everybody do on an annual basis and refresh on an annual basis. I think that's where you get your key drivers, some of your most important KPIs.
That's fascinating. I was looking at the chat. There seems to be a lot about AI and bias and fairness. And we know, one of the best practices, of course, is auditing the model. Is there a role for people analytics in that, or do
Absolutely?
Okay.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And so that in conjunction with so depends on the company, but the way I would look at it is in conjunction with your engineering team. So this is where I think depending on the sophistication or the size of a people analytics team, your people analytics team, and especially the people science arm of that, is extremely helpful in understanding how to build an experiment or how to understand what to test for bias, right? And the eng team can come in and help audit that and help test it. So there's a critical role in this. I think many of us have seen the stories or seen examples earlier on of where machine learning has perpetuated a bias. And that's exactly what we need to avoid going forward, because once that's built in, it will metastasize at scale. But yes, I think there's a critically important role for people analytics here.
Yeah, that's a good point, connecting those groups, because your pure engineering or IT group might not have access to the sensitive HR data, whereas people analytics, if it lives within HR, they may have some degree of those specialized skills, but they would have access to the data, and they can be the bridge in working with maybe the pure data scientists that might live outside of HR.
100%.
I was just going to say, having those capabilities in-house is going to be so important when you look at the regulations that are coming down the pipe. The EU's AI Act requires auditing. New York City's Anti-Bias Act actually requires third-party auditing and posting on an annual basis on your website. And then the EEOC is recommending regular self-audits. So, just being able to do that on a regular basis is going to be so important. We are almost at the top of the hour. So I do want to ask, you are the first CHRO that I've met with a people analytics background. And I'd love to hear any advice that you have for those who might be interested in following a similar path.
Yeah, I think so I'm privileged to be in the role. I think there are a couple pieces of advice. I also think it's the path of the future for the CHRO. And the reason is that data and analytics is so critical for not only managing the function and managing the workforce, but also showing the impact of our workforce on the business and stewarding that. So we think about different generations of CHROs. There's certainly been kind of a generation of relational influence, people that understood the business and had relationships inside the organization, of CHROs that had strong systems and operational knowledge, executive comp experience. I think there is a generation upcoming of CHROs that have strong data and analytics experience and finance experience. And that's because they can understand the impact that the organization is having from a data perspective, and also manage the data risks that are out there. So I'm very encouraged by that. In terms of the advice that I have, number one, lead with the business question. So what business problem are we trying to solve, and really understand the business, but do that in a way that you're keeping your employees in mind at the same time. It's not all one or the other. So we are in service of the business. Going back to one of the first comments I made, we're in service of the business, but we need to take care of our employees and take care of our workforce. And managing both is the most important thing. from my perspective, we do that informed by data. Right? And that's what kind of drives answers and provides that proverbial seat at the table, that we've talked about for so long.
Thank you for so nicely bringing us back full circle. I can't thank you enough for being on the show, RJ. We're big fans of you as co-chair of the I4C People Analytics Board, obviously. But your role is so unique, and or your journey has been so unique. So it's been a real pleasure to hear from you today. And Tom, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks a lot, Katheryn. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, I'll double down on that. Thank you, RJ. We certainly had a very effective and populated discussion over in the chat. So thanks everyone for participating today. Great questions. And thanks everyone who was sort of answering each other's questions and having a sort of a side channel dialogue. As noted by Zeta over in the chat, and also as you see here on screen, all of our Next Practice Weekly calls are available as recertification credit hours with both HRCI and SHRM. So if that's relevant for you, jot down the relevant program ID or activity ID, and you'll be all set there. Again, we will not be having Next Practices Weekly next week, given the holiday here in the US for 4th of July. But be sure and come back where Katheryn, Brekken, and Rob Cross will be the stars of the show on July 11th to talk about our big study, the Team Network Effect. Until the 11th, have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.